Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from Nodeware and IGI Cyber Labs. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. Today's SMB educational series regarding what can an SMB do to get started and what are some minimal security tactics that they can take that executives that don't have much time can get started with their teams. So we'll get started in just a moment as people are logging in. So everyone, thank you very much for attending today's session. This continues in our series of public service announcements around SMB educational series and what CEOs, CFOs, COOs of end user companies can do to be better prepared. How do they improve their risk mitigation? And how do they improve their cyber hygiene with a couple of simple steps? We've had sessions in the past around how do you move towards compliance? How do you get to cyber insurance, or how do you improve cyber insurance? We had a session specifically from the MIT Sloan School of Business about cyber hygiene and some things they learned from their research. Today, we're going to talk specifically about what an SMB can do to take a few simple steps in this area. As always, if you've been on these before, this will be recorded. We will rebroadcast it on YouTube in the next couple of days. It's also in our LinkedIn event, so you'll be able to get access to it there. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or in the question box. We will do our best to get to all of those questions. If we don't get to your questions today, we'll make sure we get back to you with the answers that you've requested. With that, I want to turn this over to Allan Alford. Allan and I have known each other for a number of years. He has joined our advisory board at Nodeware. He has been a global CISO at Fortune 100 companies. He is now in a completely different role that I'm sure he'll spend a moment talking about at TrustMap. But we are excited to have him provide his perspective on what small businesses could do and the conversation that he's going to have today with Helen Patton from Duo and Cisco Security. So Allan, with that, I will turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Stuart. Hi, everyone, Allan Alford here. As Stuart mentioned, I've been a CISO in very large organizations in the past. I am currently working in a 15-person shop, and I've worked all points in between. I think the smallest company I worked for was 5, and the biggest was 50,000. I've got a soft spot for SMB. I really do. I always have. And when Stuart first told me about Nodeware, I jumped on the advisory board specifically because I feel like Nodeware is doing a great job of helping the SMB community. And when Stuart said he wanted me to do a webinar, I thought, who else should I invite other than Helen Patton? She is the advisory CISO at Cisco Security, came in through the Duo acquisition there. Duo is part of Cisco now. And Helen's efforts at Duo are very similarly aligned with that real SMB focus. And she also has a big background, former CISO of Ohio State University, for example. Helen, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more, and we can dive in and start covering some questions.
Sure. Thanks, Allan. So hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Yeah, as Allan said, I spent about 8 years being the CISO at Ohio State. And what people tend to overlook with higher ed is that really when you're trying to do security there, you're trying to secure a city. So it's not just students, but we had startups and we had lots of IOT devices and we had a hospital and we had all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of retail. So, you know, my experience there lends itself to what we're going to be talking about today. And I've left Ohio State and I'm now working with Duo and Cisco, and we talk with a large number of companies there from all sized companies who are dealing with the same things that you are. So I'm happy to be here to have a conversation and see where we take it.
I love that. So why don't we get started then and talk about just in general before we get into the physics of what we might want to do and how we might do it, let's talk about what it is we're even facing. So what are some of the biggest cybersecurity threats that SMBs face?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think if you're reading the news, the first thing that would probably come to mind is concern about ransomware. And ransomware is really about having some kind of malicious software introduced into your environment that will encrypt and lock up your data. And then the ransom attackers will ask you for a ransom in order to get that data back. Ransomware has been around actually for quite some time. The interesting thing about ransomware is that it's starting to change a little bit too. So it's not just about having to pay a ransom to get your data back, but we're also starting to see extortion. So we're starting to see attackers say, not only do you have to pay us a ransom to get the data back, but if you don't pay us more money, usually in the form of Bitcoin or some kind of cyber coin, we may also make public the data that we have. So it's a 1-2 punch, and it can come about just because you're sitting with an internet presence, just because you have a website, just because you have devices that are connected to the internet. So you can be the victim of ransomware without being specifically targeted by the ransomware attackers. And that makes it a real problem for everyone, not just small businesses, of course, but everyone. And that seems to be the one of the bigger ones today.
All right, so what are some other big ones?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, especially if you're a small business, typically you're using software and technology that somebody else provides. It could be a Microsoft Office, it could be a G Suite, email, that kind of thing. You know, it's easy to use, it's cheap, it's online. You're also really dependent on it. And so one of the things that we also see being under attack at the moment are those kinds of services, which means your business could stop, not because you've been attacked, but because one of these vendors has been attacked. So what would happen if you couldn't get to your email today? What would happen if you couldn't get to your shared cloud document service provider today? What would happen if you couldn't get to your online billing application today? So we in the security world, we call it denial of service attacks, but it could be any kind of attack that basically interrupts your own supply chain and software supply chain. That's a big one for us as well.
Yep, inherited security problems.
Indeed.
I'm going to throw another one out there too, and I would say that not only ransomware, inherited security problems, and I think there's also sort of a whole category of stuff that, especially with SMBs, I think makes them more vulnerable, and that's the things like CEO impersonation, financial fraud, fake phone calls, fake voicemails, fake text messages. Hey, it's the CEO. I need you to transfer wire money to such and such customer, or hi, this is such and such customer, and I just changed my bank details, or any number of those kinds of attacks, I think are really still prevalent as well. And I think that's another one that SMBs face that oftentimes get overlooked in the face of something as overwhelmingly lousy as ransomware. I think sometimes people get, and I've seen people fall for it, bless their hearts. I've seen people fall for, hey, it's the CEO, I'm on the road, I'm trying to do some gift giveaways for some of our clients. Can you go order a whole bunch of Apple gift cards? Something as simple as that, but it's $2,000, out the door to the bad guys. Little things like that I think happen too. So let's switch gears then. So we've talked about kind of some of the problems we're facing. We've talked about ransomware. We've talked about inherited, risk from all these SaaS systems and third-party systems that we use. And I'm thinking of that time the entire Eastern Seaboard went down for that one provider, and that was a great example. So let's talk about some of the controls we can implement. Yeah. So how do we address the above? Let's start with ransomware. What's the best stuff we can do to defend against ransomware?
Yeah, so there's a number of things. I think the first thing an organization, especially a small business, should be thinking about is multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication, if you don't know, is a way of making sure that the person logging into your systems is the person that they say they are. And we usually do that by, in addition to having an ID and a password to log into your laptop, to log into your online system, is to have something else. It could be an application like a Google Authenticator or the Duo MFA app that pushes a confirmation to a second device that you own. It could be something like a PIN number. There are different degrees of authentication factors. Some are more secure than others, but there's a whole way around doing that. What that does is if your ID and password gets swept up and got compromised, got taken by a bad guy, and I use the term guy, by a bad person, they can't use that password to pretend to be you. They can't use that password to log into your systems and steal your data. They can't use that password to activate malicious software that's going to wrap up your data and ransom it. So multi-factor authentication is certainly one. I would also be looking at your email provider to see what kinds of email security, filtering, and services they can provide to make sure that bad emails don't make it to your inbox in the first place. We do see phishing happening through email more than sort of any other messaging vector. So email security is another one, but typically your email providers offer that kind of service as part of the email service they provide. But those would be two I'd start with for sure.
Yep. And phishing, for those who don't know, is spelled with a PH, and it's where the bad guys send a fake email attempting to get your login credentials. They'll make it look exactly like a real login page and say, hey, you need to revalidate your password, or various tricks and sundry methods they've got. But the whole idea is they're trying to steal your credentials by way of sending a naughty email. And there's also vishing, which is done by voicemail, smishing, which is done by SMS text messages. There's a million ishings out there. And then one of the other big vectors for me for ransomware that I've run into in the last couple of years that I've seen a lot of is unpatched systems. It's not uncommon for the bad guys to get in not by way of an original user account, but rather by smashing their way into a system that was vulnerable because it wasn't patched. And then once they're on that system running software tools, the bad guys can do techniques. There's mimikatz and Kerber roasting and all manner of fancy hacker terms that basically mean ways of stealing the credentials off the box from the people who had previously logged onto it before. And so you can break into the systems by way of a vulnerable system and steal credentials that way, and you're off and running with your ransomware campaign, just as if you had nabbed them from a phishing email. And so for me, it's the two-factor. I'm 100% in agreement. MFA is so important, but so is vulnerability management, knowing which servers need patching so that the bad guys can't break in that way. So I think for me, the 1-2 punch, and actually I guess there's 3 punches because I'm totally with you on email too. Email protection, MFA, and vulnerability management, knowing what is vulnerable in terms of your servers and applications and getting those patched so that the bad guys can't get in that way. To me, that's the 3-legged stool to prevent ransomware. So,
Absolutely. I would also throw in there that some security awareness on behalf of you and your employees is also a really big deal, right? Now, just because you might know what a phishing email looks like doesn't mean you're not going to click on it. And can I just tell you, when I started in my new gig here at Cisco phished us as a training thing, and I'm a CISO and I clicked on this thing because you know, I was new, I was clicking on everything, so I click on everything. So I admit it, I'm one of those people. But you need to be able to train people on what to expect and also how to protect themselves, but not just protect themselves at work, but also protect themselves at home, especially right now where we've got so many people who are at home logging in from their home networks with their home PCs, that kind of stuff. And we see that a lot in the small business environment anyway. So helping people understand just how to be personally secure, one, will make them love you as an employer, but two, it will also help them protect your data as an employer who's working with them. So 1-2 punch, but it serves two purposes to do training and awareness as well. Really important.
Yep,
really
two birds, one stone. And you're right, employees become grateful. And it's interesting, the fake phishing that the companies conduct, you know, fake attacks against your own employees and seeing if they click and whatnot. I'm a big believer in when you're going to deploy that kind of tooling and do that sort of thing, do that kind of training, make sure that you're emphasizing the positives and not the negatives. Don't punish those who click, reward those who reported the fake message. You should have in your email system, just like the email providers can protect you in the first place, they can also provide a button for you in your email client where you can actually say, hey, this looks fishy, click here and report it, and off it goes to be investigated by the right parties. And I'm a big believer in rewarding individuals who report, rewarding individuals who are cautious, and not punishing those who do click. Maybe a little supplemental training, but nothing punitive, right?
Absolutely.
And,
Sure.
and there's another company I'm thinking of that, Stuart, you should really consider for a future one of these sessions, and I'll go ahead and drop their name anyway, Wiser. They're a great security awareness training aimed at SMBs, and they have this beautiful sort of cartoon style. It's a great animated style, very short and sweet little training sessions. I highly recommend that you look into the options like them and other, there's competitors too. But there's some great SMB targeted security awareness training that's very affordable, very effective, and this idea of a short, entertaining burst of information for each employee is so much better than I'm sure most of you have been through at some point in your careers. The annual security training where you have to sit down for an hour and listen to the thing and click the thing and listen to the thing, and nobody likes that. It doesn't work. It doesn't help. Find that security awareness training that does those entertaining short bursts, and I think that's so much more effective.
Yeah, for sure.
So what about other controls? We've talked about ransomware. We've talked about the inherited third-party stuff. How do we help mitigate some of that inherited third-party stuff you talked about? You know, if I'm dependent upon Gmail, G Suite, if I'm dependent upon O365, I'm dependent upon Amazon, I'm dependent upon Workday, whatever it might be, what
Yep.
sorts of things can I do to help prepare for that?
So I think it's really hard for a small business to go tell Amazon, Google, or Microsoft to do anything. So I'm not going to tell you you've got to sort of negotiate that into your contract. Forget it. I do think there are ways that you can plan for the potential for an outage to occur. So sit down with yourself, start with yourself and your team, however big your team is, and say, what would we do if email was down for, say, 4 hours or 8 hours or, heaven help us, a week? You know, how would we continue doing business? And the answer might be some other technical thing. Well, we're going to maintain one backup account that's not, if we're using Microsoft, maybe we're going to have one free Gmail account that's going to only be used during an emergency, or flip that around if you're a Gmail shop. Might be something like that. It might also be something that's more procedural, right? So emails down, we're going to start calling people, right? So you know, how do you maintain whatever your business is for a certain amount of time? Now, the good thing about those big vendors is that they're really pretty resilient to start with. So if they're down, they're typically not down for more than a few hours. So it's reasonable to do some kind of thinking around, okay, if they were down for 8 hours, what would we do? Maybe you do nothing. Maybe you say, we can handle an 8-hour no work getting done. We'll take that risk, right? But particularly if you're dealing with smaller vendors or niche vendors, they may not be as resilient as some of the bigger companies. And so those are the ones you got to focus in on and go, if I've got this one supplier that provides us something, some widget that we depend on or whatever, and that one supplier is out, that one supplier gets ransomed, what are we going to do about it? Thinking ahead as much as possible is helpful. You may not have all the answers, but if you've thought about the questions you're going to have ahead of time, it will make responding in an emergency so much less stressful. And it will make you start to think about really what's important. And if you wait for an emergency before you start thinking about what's important, you end up like Colonial Pipeline, not a small business necessarily, but their billing system was ransomed, and they made the decision not to pump the gas, the oil, because they couldn't bill their customers. It wasn't that the pipeline was down, it was that their billing system was down. So from a small business perspective, do you really need your billing system to be up all the time in order to keep working? Or, you know, think about the component parts and work on those. Sorry, long story, long answer to a short question.
That's a great answer. I worked at one company where one of the biggest things they had that they cared about was a call center. It was an inside sales operation where they were constantly calling outbound. And it was amazing to me, every person in that call center had a little card on their desk that was basically if the whole phone system goes out, use this card, here's the numbers you dial, and use your own cell phone. And everyone had a cell phone that was either issued by the company or reimbursed by the company. It was a full backup. And when the phone system went out, they were down 30 seconds at most before everybody was switching gears and operating off these little cards and off their cell phones. Yeah. So sometimes you can have a complete backup plan. Other times, to your point, it's just a matter of being prepared and knowing what's coming. And this is all tied into the worlds of business continuity and disaster recovery, right? We call these things. And to your point, I think the most critical part of all of that is just playing the what if game. what if this goes down? Okay, now what if this is also down? Okay, now what if this stays down for 8 hours? Okay, now what if, and you just play the what if game over and over and over until you get there. That's
And
a
I would
fantastic
say,
answer.
if you want to do something like that, but you don't know where to start, go talk to your insurance companies. Especially if you've done the cyber insurance thing at all, they know how to run tabletop exercises, which are these exercises that we talk about. Or if you've got an MSP that's providing you IT support, that kind of thing, go ask them. If they don't know the answer, that's a bit of a worry, actually. So go ask your MSP how they do their own tabletop exercises and so forth, and use that relationship already. You don't have to reinvent the wheel on this one.
I love it. I love it. So I'm thinking of other controls and other things we talk about. We've got, I'm sitting here thinking of all the various controls, IDS and SASE and EDR and MDR and IPS IDS and DLP and CASB and VPN and all these other tools. And I think people get overwhelmed sometimes with this. Exactly. There's just so many acronyms and so many abbreviations and so much stuff that could be on the table.
Yeah.
It pivots to this idea that Stuart and I have talked about before of minimum viable security, right? How the heck do we know what we need to deploy to sort of meet that minimum baseline, right? In other words, we talked about ransomware as one of the greatest hits of what we're facing. Okay, so now we've talked about some great defenses against ransomware, but ransomware is not the only thing. And I know there's lots of techniques and tools out there for the more sophisticated players that have got real security teams, for the larger companies that have a true security presence. And for those who don't know, there's a very risk-based approach that CISOs talk about. Chief Information Security Officers love to talk about risk-based. Make sure that anything you do is based on, we have this known risk and we're going to address it in the following way. And this risk is a higher risk than this other risk, so we'll address this one first. There's that whole methodology. There's security frameworks like NIST CSF and ISO 27001 and all these things that we might adopt. But I think that there's also just truly a gut check, minimum viable security that you can sort of get into, regardless of risk, regardless of framework, regardless of all the tech stack and the CASBs and the DLPs and the blah, 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 blah. What's your take, Helen, on some of that sort of that minimum viable? First of all, am I totally off base here? Is
No.
minimum viable really a thing? And if so, what does that look like to you?
Yeah, no, minimum viable. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to that point, so we got an interesting question that came up on the chat.
Yep.
Oh, beautiful.
And it was from somebody that said, as an investor in a company that's, just getting started and got a little bit of revenue, what can I do as an investor to make sure the executive team is focused on a few simple things? And I think it gets right to this, minimal viable security. Once again, how do they improve their risk mitigation as they're just getting started? They're making a little bit of money, they've got some revenue, but they don't have any focus on risk mitigation or even security.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So let's take that. I'm going to call it governance approach for a second. So whether this is a question coming from an investor or a question coming from a business owner, at least on some kind of regular cadence, it can be annually, it can be every 6 months. I think somebody in the company, probably the business owner, has to take the time to say what's important about this business and what are we doing to protect this important thing. So it could be the customer database, it could be the billing system, it could be the manufacturing system if you're into that kind of thing, it could be the sales portal. In security terms, we call them the crown jewels. I have to tell you that the more you do and the bigger you get, the more crown jewels you accumulate. You turn into a bit of a jeweler, and it becomes a bit of a problem. But in the beginning, at least, to say, as an investor, to say, is the leadership of this company even thinking about this? Let's just start there. And if they're not thinking about it, then start there. Make them think about it. Make sure that they are thinking about it. That's number one. To go back to Allan's original point, I think knowing what you have from a technology perspective is important. We call it asset management, but when you do asset management, people think of it like financials, like we need to know the value of all of our widgets. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking actually about asset management of where your data is. Data is money. Data is what makes you money. Like the computers don't make you money. It's the data on your computers that make you money. But particularly right now, if you've outsourced your IT stack to a cloud provider, a Gmail, a Microsoft, somebody else, a Salesforce or whoever, you don't manage your data. They manage your data. So knowing where your data is and that you've got relationships with the people who are managing the data so that they're thinking about how to protect it is number 2. So I'd call it asset management / risk management of vendors. Your own vendors is number 2. And then number 3, again, I think, is where you do have your own equipment, making sure that it's getting scanned pretty regularly is for me jacks for openers in terms of security of any kind of company, any kind of vertical, any kind of size. So know what you have, know whether it's vulnerable or not, and know what to do. Know that you've got procedures in place to be able to deal with it when something bad happens, and assuming that something bad will happen. Don't assume that it won't. You have to assume that it will. So are you prepared in that circumstance is number 3. What do you think, Allan?
I love that, and I'm going to share, right before the show we were talking about, I used my zebra analogy. I'm going to go ahead and use that again here. Zebras have stripes, not because it's camouflage versus their environment, but because it's camouflage versus the rest of the zebras. In other words, a running herd of zebras, to the eyes of the tiger or the lion rather, who's pursuing them, it's just going to be a jumbled mess of stripes, and he's going to jump and maybe get one, maybe not. But the reality is, if you've seen those lion documentaries, that almost always a single zebra falls. And so the analogy, and the reason I bring all this up is it's oftentimes, especially in the SMB space, we feel like, why would they target us? We're not the big guy. Why would they target us? There's a million like me. I'm one drop in the barrel, and there's 999,000 other drops. There's a lot of reasons as an SMB to think it won't be you. But to me, that's the same thing as painting stripes on yourself and hiding with the rest of the herd and hoping for the best. You might be the zebra that gets taken out. A zebra always goes down when the lion attacks, at least one, right?
Yeah.
So don't be a zebra. Come up with a better camouflage besides hiding amongst your peers. And I think all 3 points that Helen gives you are great first steps about not being a zebra. And there's a little more to it than that too. I'm going to go ahead and get into a little bit of formal risk methodology. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about risk, because as Helen pointed out, you have to know what you have. You have to know where your data is and have agreements in place if it's somebody else managing that data. Either that or you have to know what it is and have a plan for yourself, right? Risk is described most conventionally as likelihood times impact. The likelihood that this particular thing would get hit, in this case, it's the crown jewels. You're a small manufacturing company, and you've got intellectual property. You've got all the stuff that you have patents about. If the competition or another nation state or somebody else were to hijack that data, it would be a big loss for the company. Bootlegs start appearing on the market, your sales plummet, et cetera. There's one example of a likelihood that's fairly high, right? Somebody wants your intellectual property. And then impact is, of course, how bad could it be? If they get these plans, is it something so complicated that nobody else could produce it? Is it something so obviously ours that anyone who tried to produce it, the rest of the market would shut them out? Or is it something that truly they could bootleg overnight and be producing clones and everybody would start buying the cheaper clones? Like, that's impact. And so if risk is likelihood times impact, in my mind, there's another layer you have to lay on top of that. And that second layer is asset times vulnerability is risk. In other words, the crown jewels that Helen just spoke to. That's your assets. Your crown jewels are your assets. And the vulnerability is how likely. It's back to that likelihood trigger on the original risk formula. If you know that you have all of your company's intellectual property, we'll keep using that example, on a single server that's on the internet with no firewall, for example, and anybody can log into it and it doesn't have MFA and anyone can just use a username and password, that's a high likelihood, high impact, high risk, high value asset. It's high on all the categories. That's a really bad place to be. And so think of your crown jewels in terms of how likely they are to be hit, in terms of how valuable they really are to you, and in terms of the impact of what would happen if the bad thing did occur. If the bad guys got the data on that asset in particular, how bad is that really? And back to Helen's point about map your world and play these exercises through and say to yourself, what if, what if, what if? All of that has to be considered when you play the what if game. And if you know for a fact that your engineering plans are on an unsecured server, move them in-house, get them on a more secured server. If you know for a fact that the most vital customer data you have with social security numbers and all that kind of stuff is on a server that doesn't have MFA, get MFA on that server. Walk through impact, walk through likelihood, walk through asset value, walk through damage cost value, and play with all of those variables as you start to consider what you consider. And so to the investor question or to the business owner question, focus on those things. Focus on what matters the most. That's where you should be putting your attention as a security practitioner in my mind.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things when I talk to small businesses, there is this sense that they're not likely to be hit. I want to extend that zebra analogy a little bit. It's not that there's a herd of 750 zebras and 3 lions. There's 750 zebras and about 75,000 lions. The likelihood that they can run at the pack and grab somebody is almost guaranteed, right? If there's been some studies done in terms of how quickly, if you put a vulnerable asset like a server or a workstation on the internet, how quickly before somebody tries to exploit that vulnerability. And unfortunately, the answer to that generally is seconds, not minutes, not hours, not days. If you put something on the internet, that includes a laptop or a mobile phone or a this or a that, and it's got a known vulnerability on it, somebody's using machine learning and artificial intelligence to find it. It's not that there's some hacker sitting in a basement somewhere with their hoodie on who's got to go and find you. They're just trolling the internet looking for vulnerabilities. They're going to find you. So again, we got to go back to assume it's going to happen. So that's the bad news. The good news is, though, I think there's a lot that we can do that doesn't cost a lot of money. MFA doesn't cost a lot of money, right? There are scanners out there that don't cost a lot of money. Training and awareness is free. There are password managers that your employees can use so they're not reusing the same password in your systems as they are on Facebook. And those password managers are free, right? So there is a lot that is out there that you can take advantage of without having to dip into your bank account to do it. But you've got to spend the time. Time's money, I know. But this is an investment in time that will save you a lot on the back end. So worth the time to do it.
I love that. I love that a lot. And yeah.
If I could interrupt for 1 second, we just had another question come in that I think is really pertinent. And it reminds me a little bit of a conversation I had the other day. The question was, what about DAS and SaaS environments? Is there a different approach to security? As we move more and more to the cloud, it seems to me that the security picture will change. And I had somebody tell me the other day that, yes, the more the world moves to cloud, the world changes. But since you're always going to have a local network with printers and with cameras and with Ring doorbells and various other devices in an IoT environment, point of sale and the like, yes, the picture changes, but the local requirements for what's exploitable still remains the same. And I'm just curious of your perspective on how you think the security world changes for small business as people move to cloud, what's left behind, and how quickly that IoT type function continues to be enhanced. And then obviously, Helen, your perspective as well.
Yeah, so I think Helen started down that path already about the SAST and DAST. And Helen, I'll let you elaborate on that, and I'll tackle the IoT maybe, and then you can jump in on IoT as well.
Yeah, I'm going to jump all over the place. So I think companies that are starting out today, many of them starting out cloud native. They do not have on-prem anything. They don't have on-prem anything. And what we're seeing out of young, I say this as a higher ed CISO, younger people today are coming through. They don't have printers at home. So what we're seeing, especially now that we've gone to COVID, is business processes that rely on paper way less. So printers, I think I'm going to predict, don't quote me on this, printers are going to go away at some point. We will stop printing stuff out. It's going to take a little while, but we're going to get there, right? So where am I going with this? Whether you have an on-prem component, a cloud component only, or a hybrid, the question that is being asked now in the security world is, where is the edge? So if everything you have is on-prem, you can use a firewall, and which is sort of an old school way of thinking about security, and you can put security controls around that firewall, and you can make sure everything inside it does whatever it wants, and you're fine. That's the old model. Cloud model says you're accessing your data from anywhere, on any device, from any kind of network, and the controls that you put in place from a security perspective now sit actually as close to the data as possible. So this is where we're starting to see this concept of zero trust, and apologies for more security buzzwords. But what really zero trust means is to say, whenever you log into something, whether that's on-prem, whether that's in the cloud, at that time, we're going to validate that you're secure, and not just that you have a second factor from an MFA perspective, but also that the device you're using to log in with, your laptop, your mobile phone, whatever, isn't jailbroken, doesn't carry a vulnerability. We're not even going to let you in. We're going to scan first at time of request, and you have to be clean before you get in. Think of it about like wearing a mask. I know this is not politically popular. This is the equivalent of wearing a mask before you walk into a restaurant. Same kind of idea applies, right? So I think it's going to be less relevant where you work, and it will be more relevant how you work. And again, I think in the small business side, the ability, it will depend on the vertical, but largely the ability to pivot from being wholly on-prem to being mostly in the cloud, if not completely in the cloud, might be a little bit easier for smaller companies and small businesses to do that than some of the bigger companies. So I'm less worried about that. IoT is a thing though, Allan. So what are you thinking about IoT?
Yeah, so you already stole some of my thunder there. This idea that you don't let a jailbroken phone onto the network, or access to the data, I should say, rather, because again, this isn't about on-prem anymore. It's not about on the network. It's about accessing the data. This is zero trust. This is secure access service edge. Sorry, more security buzzwords. SASE, S-A-S-E. There are a variety of tools out there that can monitor the health of the device and validate that health before it's allowed to connect up to the thing and do the thing. And so with IoT, I think it's imperative to do that. I think a lot of IoT manufacturers, and it depends on, for the business world, there's a wide variety of IoT. We're talking printers and things more of that nature, things you would see in a business environment, versus at home, you would have the doorbell and, whatever. But everybody might have cameras, and everyone might have sensors and smoke detectors and, all manner of things running around. The smart coffee pots, the smart refrigerators, there's, the more IoT gets invented, the greater the likelihood that any particular device isn't patched, has a known vulnerability, that the manufacturer hasn't even come up with a way to deploy patches. This is the really scary one to me with IoT versus a lot of the other stuff, like a traditional, computer, laptop, server, whatever it might be. Some of these manufacturers didn't even consider the idea that they would need to push new software to the device. It sells with whatever's on it, and that's all you ever get. And that one turns out to be vulnerable, and guess what? You just inherited 100 vulnerable fill in the blanks, and there's not a thing you can do about it. So maintaining that awareness of vulnerability, and we're back to vulnerability scanners and knowing what's out there and what's bad, combined with, as Helen said, zero trust is the only possible solution around some of that stuff. Some of it you may just decide we're going to have to decommission this stuff. Like it's just too much risk, and we're not going to allow this stuff to be on the network anymore. Fine, you can throw the switch that says anybody that logs in with this kind of device and is trying to access this kind of data, shut them off. And you can make that blanket declaration, but other times you can insist on, oh, it's allowed, but only once it's on patch revision 3.4. Today it's on 3.0. We got to get it up to 3.4, and then we'll let it communicate. So there's a lot of options there, and it ties into zero trust, and it ties into whether or not the manufacturer has given you that capability. And it all boils down to upfront health checks, which is the variety of tools involved in that combine with zero trust tooling. But to me, that's the solution there. It's some of what you talk about mixed with that health check piece.
Yeah. What I am seeing sort of trend-wise is if we talk about traditional administrative systems, word processing, customer relationship managers, those kinds of things, all of those things are headed to the cloud, even if you're a traditional business. So the administrative side's going to the cloud. What will remain on-prem will be some of the IoT stuff, the manufacturing stuff. There is an organization in the US called mxdusa.org, MXD. They do manufacturing stuff. They have specifically a focus on small business manufacturing, and they've got a cybersecurity group. I say that because I'm on the advisory committee for that group, but they have a lot of resources for small businesses. So if you're in the manufacturing segment and you're a small business, or you're thinking about getting into it, go check out mxdusa.org. They've got a lot of free resources there. They've also got a manufacturing floor that you can test things out on. So both virtual and in place in Chicago. So there's resources for you, even if you're going to be dealing with a lot of IoT or manufacturing OT kinds of stuff that's available for you to use.
Beautiful.
So Allan, I guess it sounds like, even if you have if you have a company of Gen X people that aren't going to print anything out, that aren't moving to paper, and you're going to, over time, retire all the people that are paper oriented, you still got a lot of IoT devices with a lot of vulnerability exposure, and you got to figure out from a priority and zero trust standpoint, which of those devices are exploitable and which ones do you need to fix and which ones can you avoid.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And then once you understand what bucket they go in, you make your decision as to how you're going to manage them. Zero trust and do or don't allow them access to other things in your environment or other data in your environment. And when I say your environment, I mean, of course, cloud as well.
So maybe that leads to, if you're an SMB, if you're an executive at an SMB and you don't have much IT and security support, getting back to identifying what's vulnerable, figuring out what you want to do with them, and taking a couple of these simple steps starts to get you to what you were talking about from a minimal security standpoint.
Yep. No, that ties into it exactly. And it goes right back to that conversation, everything Helen said about crown jewels, right? Those IoT devices may actually be crown jewels for you. They may not be, but they may have access to crown jewels. And so you need to walk through all those physics and think of always the value of the asset, the impact of if that asset goes bye-bye or gets ransomed or gets taken or stolen by the competitors or whatever it might be. And then that likelihood and that impact and that risk, all of those factors need to be combined. And I think it ties into that quite well. So Helen, that's a nice segue, I think. And actually, before we do that, I'm going to share one little story. In the last 2.5 years of my work life, I have used a printer for one and only one purpose. I've done it multiple times, but I've used it for one purpose and one purpose only, and you're going to laugh at what this purpose is. Printing up and signing and scanning and sending back third-party risk documentation.
Yeah, I know. Can I tell you, so when I'm not telling a story I'm not allowed to tell in public. The first time we fished at Ohio State, we fished everybody. The departments that clicked on this scenario, the scenario was, here's a PDF from the printer on the second floor. The departments that clicked on that was legal and HR. And I say that not because I want to beat up on legal and HR, but because their business processes involved PDFs off printers, and they were just clicking through, right? So the answer here isn't whether or not you've got stupid users, or you got to look at your business processes and say, hang on, are we requiring people to print something out so that we can get a signature? Do we really need a signature? If we need a signature, can we go to an electronic signature service as opposed to having a printer, right? Same things for cameras. Do we really need cameras on the same network segment that we've got our billing system for our customers? Probably not. So put them, you may still need the cameras, but do you need them in the same network location as everything else? Probably not. So let's put them somewhere else. Those kinds of things. So from a small business perspective, it can be a little overwhelming to go, oh, I've got to now inventory every asset I have. Don't think about it from an asset perspective that way. Think about it from a business process perspective. What are the process flows in your business that are most important to you? Then what are the assets that support that process? Then what are the vulnerabilities on those assets? So it's sort of a peeling an onion kind of approach to it, but you start with key business process and work down to your tech from there.
That's perfect. That's perfect, because it's not just about asset prioritization, it's about business process prioritization. I love it. And it lets you tackle one little bit at a time.
To that point, you're kind of getting to network segmentation and what devices and what priority and what applications are sitting on which network that are the crown jewels versus the ones that are maybe lower in priority. Any thoughts, if you're a small business, when you should ask your MSP to provide network segmentation based on that prioritization, or where you ought to do that yourself?
I'd say the very first time you're engaging with a vendor to decide whether they're going to provide your IT support or not, I would be asking them what their security recommendations are for the kind of business you're in and the kind of work you do, including network segmentation, right? It may not, if there's like 5 of you in an office, it may not make a whole bunch of sense to have a network segmentation to start with, but as to your point, as soon as you start adding in IoT devices and stuff like that, maybe it is. But I would expect an MSP to be able to give you some advice around that. That should be part of your vetting process for your MSPs, to be honest, is do they understand the security implications of the kinds of technologies and services they're providing to you? And if they don't, it might be time to find somebody else who does.
Yep,
Sure.
it should be intrinsic. To me, to Helen's point, full agreement. It should be intrinsic. My home network, for example, I have 3 networks. I have all the workstations and laptops and desktops and everybody that can access each other, see the printers, and get to the internet. I have the guest wireless network where they can get to the internet but can't get to anything else on my network. And then I have the IoT network, which is where my barbecue grill, my doorbell, and my cameras all reside. Yes, I have an internet-enabled barbecue grill. I'm a Texan. We're allowed to do that. So yeah, 3 networks, and that's even just at home. That's not even a business. That's just at home. I automatically have 3 networks. So I think this kind of thing is intrinsic, should be inherent, should be early stage conversations for certain.
Well, as a commercial coming up in a few weeks, we have a group of MSPs that are on a similar SMB educational series talking about what MSPs can do to help small businesses and how small businesses should rely on MSPs. So I think this will be great, discussion for that panel coming up in a few weeks.
Beautiful. So that leads me to some more questions I've got for Helen, which is when we talk about how business leaders of SMBs can get help. We've mentioned MSSP a couple of times now. I'm thinking of all the things that are out there. Sometimes there's partnerships with VARs. Sometimes there's MSP versus MSSP. There's MDRs. There's fractional CISOs. There's vCISOs. What in your mind is the best way to start that whole process? Not everybody has the staff they need in-house. There's all these options for out-of-house. Where do you begin?
Yeah, I'm actually, I'm a big proponent of networking. So I'm assuming, it could be a bad assumption, but I'm assuming as a small business owner, you have colleagues who are small business owners. And chances are one of them have already begun sort of looking into this. Go have a chat with that person, see what they learned, what they didn't learn. There is definitely a role for a virtual CISO. A virtual CISO is somebody who is going to be working for you sort of part-time. They're probably contracted in, and they're going to help you come up with a strategy. Now, you've got to be sort of you've got to be into the maturity of your organization before it's worth doing that. So again, going back to, you're going to have an MSP who's going to be providing IT support. I'd be starting there from what do we need to be doing to secure the nuts and bolts of technology. But once you get beyond that, yeah, your virtual CISOs can definitely be a place to go. Now, within that, you may want to reach out to your VAR and see if they've got recommendations on virtual CISO organizations that you can engage with if you're not sure who. They can also put you in contact with other just security vendors of certain products. So if you know that you're looking for, say, a vulnerability scanner, your VARs can put you in contact with those kinds of vendors who also happen to know virtual CISOs and other sort of consulting organizations like that can provide that. Beyond that, I think there are some other things to think about in terms of getting some security resources. Go take a look at your local community college, and if you're around a 4-year college, go take a look there. There are interns there that are students that are hungry to get their hands on your boxes and help you out, and they're cheap. They're usually trained up, so don't get someone who's a freshman, but get someone who's maybe coming off the back of a college associate's degree in cybersecurity, or going into maybe their junior year in a 4-year program. But bring them in for the summer and have them poke around and see what they can see and see what they can do. It's going to open up your eyes quite a bit. Students are creative and they want to do the right thing. They're motivated to do the right thing. So take advantage of those opportunities as well.
I love that. That's good stuff. So how about MSSP, MDR? Any thoughts in that space? I haven't even defined those terms, by the way. I'm just throwing them out.
Yeah, why don't you define the terms?
All right. So MSP is managed services provider, which is IT outsourcing. MSSP adds the word security in there, and so you're outsourcing specifically security stuff. And MDR is managed detection and response. And the difference between MSSP and MDR sometimes is very fuzzy. Sometimes they're one and the same. Theoretically, one is outsourcing some of your security, and the other one is doing a little bit more active monitoring of your environment. But fundamentally, they're about the same thing. What's some advice there? Again, it sounds like maybe you're going to say networking and talk to people who found successful journeys there, or what's your thoughts?
I'm always going to say networking. I think some of it will depend on the structure of the technology stack that you have. So I would say if you have a technology footprint of your own, so you're not completely cloud native, everything sits up in the cloud sitting on a Google Suite or Azure, AWS or whatever. If you've got on-prem stuff, having an organization that can scan your environment, looking for threats, looking for bad things that are happening, it's not something that's going to be easy to do in-house. That it's hard to get the talent, it's hard to keep the talent. It might be better for a small business to think about that from an MSSP perspective. So if you've got a footprint of your own, I'd consider outsourced services for security operations center scanning support. If the technology that you've got is particularly unique, you may have to pay for that yourself, just because the standard sort of MSSP may not know enough about your particular environment that even if they see something, they can do something about it. You may need some in-house folks to do something with that. But when it comes to outsourcing security services, I would be looking at that. The other thing to think of is if you're a small business and you're developing your own software, I think an MSSP to be able to come in and test the quality of your code and to pen test your software is another place where you would want an external party to come in. So I'd be looking at that as well if that's the kind of business that you're in.
I love that. That's a really good point. Stuart, am I allowed to do a shameless plug for the day job? It's a natural segue. A new idea just occurred to me based on what Helen just said.
I think you should not, but I think you should do that. I also think you should plug in Helen's point about networking. You have a certain session on Clubhouse that you should probably plug as well.
So the Clubhouse session, unfortunately, we've actually canceled the Clubhouse session, at least temporarily. We're no longer doing that. I do have the Cyber Ranch podcast, which is a fantastic resource. I have different guests, folks like Helen, who come on, talk about one particular topic per show. We'll dive into, one specific world about penetration testing or vulnerability management or whatever it might be, one topic per show. That's a good resource. There's plenty of other good podcasts out there that aren't mine that I'm more than willing to steer folks to. But as far as the day job goes, what I do with the day job, and the reason I left my 50,000 person shop to go work at a 15-person startup, is we basically help businesses do a rapid maturity assessment to figure out where they are from a security perspective, get a flag in the sand to say, here's where I am today, and allow that assessment to survive over time and be tested and benchmarked against over time so that you can actually track and measure and monitor the progress of your security program, predict what your labor and spend is going to be, and get yourself from a 3 to a 4 on a scale of 5 or whatever the goals might be. Basically, that's what I do with the day job. If anyone's interested, feel free to follow up and ping me there. That's TrustMap. And we do a lot of work with SMBs, and I think it's very important. It's knowing yourself, knowing where you stand, and then helping develop a plan to get to where you want to be. That's what we do there. So I just thought I'd throw that out.
Absolutely. You guys play a critical role. And, this all started because we were trying to provide, a series of public service announcements to help small businesses with a couple of simple and easy things they could do, because most of them have desktop support and it's outsourced and they don't have an MSP and they don't have a security person, and they're trying to figure out how do they do a couple of things. And it comes back to kind of, I think, what you guys started, and maybe with 5 minutes to go, it's probably worth having you kind of recap, Helen, the 3 things you talked about early on. Here's 3 things you could easily do to get started if you haven't done anything. Or Allan, to your point, some things that you want to leave the SMB executives with that they should they should look to do next, or be able to communicate to their board where they're going as it relates to, minimal risk mitigation next steps?
Yep. Helen, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I'll give you the three. Hopefully my memory kicks in and I don't give you a whole new three. Multi-factor authentication to protect, making sure that the people logging into your stuff are your people and not somebody you're not expecting. Vulnerability management scanning, so making sure that the things you have, the assets that you have, don't hold vulnerabilities that you're unaware of. You can choose to ignore them, but at least know about them. And then the third thing is generally asset management. But again, I'll emphasize, go through the lens of understanding your critical business processes to understand what your critical assets are, and then go and look at those assets and make sure that you've got the right controls around it. Fourth one, training and awareness. And in the training and awareness space, tabletop exercises and running through your incident response plans ahead of time. I would definitely put that in there as well.
I can't argue with any of that. That's a perfect list to me. That's 1 through 4 right there. Boom, go do it, folks. Only thing I would add is, for the business owners and investors, it's, I'll even summarize more simply the super succinct version of what Helen just said, which is see it, manage it, secure it. Step 1, know thyself. Know what you have, know what your data is, know what your processes are, know what your entry points are, know what your risks are, know thyself. Measure thyself, and then craft a plan. And if that plan involves bringing in partners, MSSPs, outsiders, all these options we've discussed, free resources, there's free security awareness training, there's free password vaults, as Helen mentioned. There's lots of free, there's lots of outsourced, there's lots of spend a little. Don't execute on any of it until you know yourself and have a plan.
Mm-hmm. I am going to give you one plug. There's a book that's come out recently written by a colleague of ours. His name is Chris Castaldo. Chris wrote a book called Startup Secure. So the stuff that Allan and I have spoken about today are all incorporated into that book as well. You'll find it on Amazon. You'll find it on Audible. But it's a really great resource if you're a small business or a startup that is trying to work out how to take care of this security stuff while you're starting up and growing. Good resource to have.
Yeah, that's a fantastic book. I got to be an early reviewer of that book. So that was, that's a great resource, and that's a good shout out too. Chris has written a fantastic book there.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you both very much. I really appreciate you spending the time to do this. As I said at the beginning, we've had a series of these public service announcements educating small businesses. We have one coming up the end of the month with a group of MSPs that are talking about how do they help small businesses. We have one from HackerOne coming up talking about how do they break into small businesses and what you should be aware of. We hopefully will have one soon from somebody at CISA or somebody at DHS talking about the White House executive letters and executive orders for critical infrastructure and small businesses. And we will continue to have a series of these educational sessions for small business leaders as to how they can get started, what they can do on their own, and what they can do with their MSPs to get to the next level with, as I always say, kind of what are the simple and safe things they can do to get started. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. As I said, this will be recorded. This will be on YouTube in a couple of days. Please join our LinkedIn events coming up, and you'll have access to this. And if you have any additional questions, please submit them on the LinkedIn event, and we'll make sure we get back to you. With that, Allan and Helen, unless you have a couple of last remarks, we'll hang up with a minute to go.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me too, Stuart.
Perfect.
And Helen, thank you.